wasn't just stuff that got dumped into the water. It was in the air, it's in the water, it's in the soil. And now you've got this buildup of material that like people are afraid to even move it because it could make it worse.
They did everything they could to fight us instead of cooperating and doing the right thing.
If this was like in Palo Alto, people would have done something about it, but because it was there, those people didn't really have a voice, didn't have any political power over them. It wasn't an even playing field.
They spent, hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers to fight us. They even filed a bogus trespassing lawsuit against my predecessor, the executive director that was before me.
The question is, how high up do we have to go to get a positive result for Oxnard?
And then ultimately filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, basically to try to evade our lawsuit.
I never experienced that before. A business model based on bald-faced lying and litigation.
This is a toxic dump, and it's not a place for people to live, period. Over the years, I knew that this place was there, but didn't really, at the time, being a newer officer, didn't really understand the extent of what it was and what it had done to the environment here. As years went on and the plant closed, I became more and more aware of what was going on there, seeing that the changes in the area, particularly in the past couple years, were becoming a lot more profound. I remember years ago that the parkland, the wetlands right next to Halaco, just to the west, the Ormond Beach area, vegetation seemed like it was a lot more lush. But the thing was that there used to be groups of kids used to go there on the weekends and do nature walks. That type of activity was very common to see back then during the days. And in the past years, it seemed to really kind of waned with Halaco looming there because it brought with it a lot of other things that made that area less hospitable or less inviting to people.
The whole Halaco fiasco was the result of a series of regulatory failures. And the first regulatory failure was the Coastal Commission's effort to remove Halaco from the coastal zone shortly after the coastal law was passed. The second regulatory failure was US EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers when they sued Halaco and sought to have them removed from the wetlands. And in the middle of that enforcement action, it was revealed that a contractor sampling for EPA had falsified some results. And Halaco went to town on that, and that was the end of that enforcement. And they stayed away from Halaco until many, many years later, once it was a Superfund site. And then the third regulatory failure was the Regional Water Quality Control Board, LA Region. They had issued a series of permits to Halaco to operate the waste piles. And they issued the industrial stormwater permit once that was required by the Clean Water Act to Halaco's industrial operations. They never took any enforcement action against Halaco during the first 15, 20 years of its operation and the 20 years of its original permitting. Staff had been out there and seen it, taken samples, knew what was going on, and they did nothing.
Halaco was able to pollute for so long basically because, there are a lot of government agencies involved that had a role, Air Pollution Control District, EPA, the county, the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And all of these agencies were aware that there was a problem. And in fact, EPA filed a notice of violation, several notices of violation in the early 80s, and told Halaco they needed to clean up, but then never really followed up. And so Halaco just continued to do what it did and pollute.
I was very interested in doing Clean Water Act work, which I had been doing quite a bit of before I came there. And they didn't have anybody who was really doing that work. And so I was watching various notices coming out from the regional board, and Halaco caught my attention because it had a waste discharge requirements, which is the state Clean Water Act sort of permit. It did not have a federal NPDES permit. So that was a big trigger for me because this place was a disaster, just in everything that you'd read about it, as far as contamination coming out of there. And then I started looking at the cases too, and really what was going on with Halaco all those years was their lawyer. He was really good at bullying the agencies into backing off. So the regional board had been after him at some points. He took the Coastal Commission to court. He took the Army Corps of Engineers to court about the dredge and fill discharges, basically saying it wasn't a wetland. One of his famous quotes was, "Just because there's pickled weed doesn't mean it's a wetland." So, and the Army Corps backed off and didn't require a permit. So they didn't have all these permits, and the ones that they did have, they weren't complying with. So that made me think that maybe we should file a lawsuit, not realizing, what I was getting into. But yeah, so that's how it all started.
Halaco, as part of Halaco's business model, which was aggressively litigating against any agency or citizen group that tried to stop them from continuing to pollute the water and the air in the area and profit from that, they brought a series of motions, most of them baseless. Like all of them baseless. We beat every one of those motions, but it took about a year and a half to do that.
Channel Keeper and ADC filed suit against Halaco in 2001, and rather than coming to the table like most defendants do to negotiate a workable settlement between both parties, Halaco hired lots of lawyers and fought us every step of the way. And one of the other efforts they did to try and get out of complying with and settling with us was they filed a trespass lawsuit against my predecessor, the executive director of Channel Keeper at the time. He had climbed up onto the pile and took some pictures, and they said that he was trespassing and violating their rights. And of course, the court dismissed that as a frivolous lawsuit that was clearly an effort to try and get out of doing the right thing. And then after that, they filed for bankruptcy and then finally agreed to sit down and settle with us.
Population characteristics, which include sensitive populations and socioeconomic factors.
My name is Raul Lopez, R-A-U-L-L-O-P-E-Z. Give it as much weight until, I see the eyes of my kids looking back at me. For me, I don't take my kids to the beaches in Oxnard anymore. When you drive down the coast of Oxnard and you see the smokestacks.
Well, when Halaco was operating from 1965 till about 2004, I think is when they shut down, the people who lived and worked around that area would often complain of headaches and respiratory ailments and nausea. And a lot of that was from the air pollution that was coming out of the smokestacks from the facility. And ultimately that was what forced Halaco to shut down. When we settled with Halaco, one of the requirements of our settlement was that they install a kind of an automatic pollution control or sensor on the smokestacks, as well as be subject to third-party sort of unannounced monitoring of air emissions. And they exceeded that one time, sort of shortly after we had that in place. And then they said, oh, that's just an anomaly. And, you know, it was a problem and we fixed it. And then it happened again a couple months later. And fortunately, the agencies, the air pollution control agency said, you can't continue to operate if you can't control the air pollution. And that's ultimately what forced them to shut down in 2004. And now that they're no longer operating, you know, again, the biggest problem is the pile that still sits there.
This thing has so many different moving parts. The Halaco problem is so many different variables that come into play, and whether it's environmental, whether it's political, you know, whether it's sociological, dealing with public safety, dealing on people's perceptions about the homeless, people that care about the environment. You have nature, people that are advocates for nature. There's all these different moving parts there, and then you have a city that's caught in the middle too. You know, to the city, what are we going to do with a property like that? You know, can the city take over a property like that? Well, if they do, they take on all the other things that go with it. And there's literally millions of dollars worth of repairs that likely needed to take place there. So you have all these different things that come up in this environment, and it causes just a very complicated issue. And it's very difficult to come up with a solution that's going to make everybody happy.
A big concern, obviously, though, is the fact that there are a lot of homeless people living on or near that area who may have that chronic exposure still. So that is a concern for sure. But, you know, again, the fact that that pile is still sitting there and it's contaminating groundwater, that's the biggest concern.
Overall, what's happened at that site is, in my opinion, it's a tragedy. It's an environmental tragedy. It's had a lot. It's told in a number of different ways. It's been a big drain on resources for the city. The city has had to front the money to pay for a lot of the cleanup there at this point. It's been a drain on public safety resources for fire and police responses. It, you know, was really, prior to the past few weeks, it was a very unsafe place.